Have you ever wondered why some people seem to achieve everything without breaking a sweat? They don't scramble, they don't hustle frantically, they don't broadcast their accomplishments to the world. They don't post motivational quotes at 5 in the morning or humble brag about their 16-hour workdays. Yet somehow, they always end up exactly where they need to be at precisely the right moment. Think about it. You probably know two types of people in your life right now. Person A exhausts themselves climbing the ladder. They're always busy, always stressed, always proving themselves to someone, anyone who will pay attention. They respond to every email within minutes, as if speed is the ultimate measure of professionalism. They say yes to every opportunity, terrified that saying no means missing their big break. They attend every networking event, every conference, every happy hour, collecting business cards like some kind of professional Pokemon trainer. They wear their exhaustion like a badge of honor, like suffering is proof of dedication. And yet, despite all this relentless, grinding effort, despite the sacrificed weekends and the neglected relationships and the stress-induced health problems, they seem to move forward at a glacial pace. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, constantly hustling but never quite arriving. Then there's person B, calm, deliberate, almost maddeningly unhurried. They seem to do half as much, work half the hours, stress half as often. Yet their results are twice as impactful. When they speak, people listen. Not because they speak loudly, but because they speak rarely enough that their words carry weight. When they act, things change. Not because they're always acting, but because when they move, it's with surgical precision. They appear at the right moment, not all the time. They're in the room when decisions are made, but somehow absent from the endless meetings that lead nowhere. What separates these two people isn't talent, though talent helps. It isn't luck, though luck plays its role. It isn't even hard work, because person A is arguably working much harder than person B. The difference is something far more subtle and infinitely more powerful, something that most people never discover because they're too busy being busy to step back and see the pattern. Success doesn't come from doing more, it comes from choosing the exact right moment to act and having the discipline to do nothing until that moment arrives. This is what I call the power of strategic restraint. And by the end of this exploration, you'll understand why the most dangerous people in any room are often the quietest ones. Why your constant busyness might be the very thing holding you back from everything you want. And why learning to do less might be the most difficult and most valuable skill you ever develop. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. In a world obsessed with constant action, the ability to be strategically still is a superpower. And most people will never develop it because they're too afraid of what they might discover in the silence. Let me tell you something that might sting a little, something that might challenge the very foundation of everything you've been taught about success. You've been lied to your entire life. From the moment you entered the education system, from your first day of kindergarten when you learned that sitting still and following instructions would earn you gold stars, you were fed a beautiful, comforting lie. A lie so elegant in its simplicity that it's almost impossible to question. The more effort you put in, the more success you'll get out. Work hard, stay busy, hustle relentlessly, never stop grinding, and the universe will reward you proportionally. Input equals output. Effort equals results. Suffering equals virtue. It's a lie so pervasive, so deeply embedded in our collective consciousness, that questioning it feels almost heretical, like standing up in church and announcing that you're not sure this whole religion thing makes sense. Our schools celebrate it, hanging posters about hard work and perseverance. Our workplaces demand it, measuring our value by hours logged rather than problems solved. Our social media glorifies it, with entrepreneurs performing productivity theater for their followers, posting their 4 a.m. routines and their 17-step morning rituals. The busier you are, the more valuable you must be. The more exhausted you look, the more dedicated you must be. Right? Wrong. Catastrophically, expensively, life-destroyingly wrong. Here's the brutal truth that nobody wants to hear. The truth that will upset people who have built their entire identity around being busy. 90% of your effort is either useless or actively working against you. You're not just spinning your wheels, wasting time that could be spent on leisure or relationships or actual rest. You're fighting battles that don't need to be fought. You're solving problems that don't matter, that wouldn't have consequences if you simply ignored them. You're exhausting yourself in ways that produce nothing of lasting value, creating the illusion of progress while actually running in place on a treadmill set to an ever-increasing speed. This isn't some motivational speaker telling you to work smarter, not harder, serving up the same reheated advice you've heard 1,000 times. This is something far more fundamental, far more challenging to implement, far more uncomfortable to accept. This is about understanding the nature of energy itself, both psychological and strategic, and recognizing that the game you think you're playing isn't actually the game at all. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who mapped the human psyche with unprecedented depth and nuance, understood something crucial about human nature that most people never grasp. He understood that psychic energy, the mental and emotional fuel that powers your thoughts, decisions, and actions, is fundamentally finite. You don't have unlimited capacity for attention, for decision-making, for creative thinking, for emotional regulation. Every thought draws from a limited reservoir. Every decision depletes a specific resource. Every action costs something that cannot be easily replenished. When you scatter your energy across 1,000 meaningless tasks, responding to every notification, jumping between contexts every few minutes, saying yes to every request, you have nothing left for the moments that actually matter. You're bankrupt when opportunity arrives. Niccolo Machiavelli, the Renaissance political philosopher whose name became synonymous with cunning strategy, whose very name conjures images of manipulation and ruthless calculation, understood this from a different angle, from the perspective of raw power dynamics. He studied rulers, generals, and power players across history, both his contemporaries and the ancient figures whose stories shaped European political thought. And he noticed something striking, something that contradicted the heroic narratives people preferred to tell about great leaders. The ones who lasted, the ones who truly won, the ones whose influence survived their deaths, weren't the ones fighting every battle, responding to every threat, trying to control every variable. They were the ones who knew exactly when to strike and when to hold back, when to reveal their hand and when to fold, when to engage and when to strategically withdraw. Timing and restraint. These weren't signs of weakness or cowardice or lack of ambition. They were the ultimate expressions of strength, the mark of someone who understood the game at a level most players never reach. So let me reframe this for you in a way that might be uncomfortable, but is absolutely necessary if you want to break free from the hamster wheel of meaningless busyness. This isn't laziness, this is lethality. Doing less isn't about being passive or giving up or lowering your standards. It's about being surgical, about understanding that one perfectly timed action can accomplish what 1,000 scattered efforts cannot. It's about channeling all of your energy, all of your focus, all of your accumulated power into the singular moment that changes everything, rather than bleeding it out across 1,000 paper cuts of meaningless activity. The question isn't whether you should work hard. Hard work has its place. The question is, are you working on things that actually move the needle, that create compounding returns, that change the trajectory of your life? Or are you just performing busyness to avoid the uncomfortable truth that most of what you do doesn't matter, has never mattered, and will never matter, no matter how much effort you pour into it? Because here's what happens when you're honest with yourself. You realize that you're spending 80% of your time on things that produce 20% of your results. And you're doing it because being busy feels safer than being strategic, because action feels more responsible than patience, because everyone else is doing it, so it must be right. But what if everyone else is wrong? What if the entire system is designed to keep you exhausted, reactive, and powerless? What if your busyness is the cage and strategic restraint is the key? We live in a culture that worships exhaustion like a deity, that treats burnout like a rite of passage, that measures your worth by how close you are to collapse. Being busy has become the ultimate status symbol, more valuable than wealth, more impressive than achievement, more socially acceptable than any other claim to importance. When someone asks how you're doing, the socially acceptable answer, the answer that signals you're a serious person doing important things, is some variation of crazy busy, or absolutely swamped, or barely keeping my head above water. If you say you're relaxed, you're lazy. If you say you have free time, you're irrelevant. If you admit that your life has space in it, room to breathe, capacity for spontaneity, people look at you with suspicion, wondering what you're hiding, questioning whether you're really as successful as you claim. This isn't accidental. This isn't some organic cultural evolution. This is cultural programming at its finest, a shared delusion we've all agreed to participate in. Modern society has convinced us that perpetual motion equals value, that if we're not constantly doing, producing, responding, performing, optimizing, and hustling, we're somehow falling behind in a race that never ends and has no finish line. We've turned busyness into an addiction, a drug we use to avoid confronting deeper questions about meaning, purpose, mortality, and the terrifying possibility that we might be fundamentally empty inside, that all our activity is just noise covering silence. But here's what the history books won't tell you in quite this way. What gets lost in the sanitized versions of Renaissance politics that focus on dates and treaties rather than the raw psychology of power. The rulers of the Renaissance, the Medicis and the Borgias, and the various princes and dukes that Machiavelli studied and advised, they understood something profound about the nature of power. They understood that power isn't about constant action, it's about strategic positioning. The victors weren't the ones fighting every battle, responding to every slight, asserting their authority at every opportunity. They were the ones who had the discipline to wait, to observe, to let others exhaust themselves in petty conflicts, and then to strike with devastating precision at the one moment that mattered, the moment when the entire board could be flipped. They knew when not to act, and that knowledge, that restraint, that strategic patience was what separated them from the countless ambitious people who burned bright and fast before disappearing into historical footnotes. Think about that for a second. Really sit with it. In a world obsessed with action, with doing, with visible hustle, their greatest power was inaction. Their strength wasn't in what they did, though they could act decisively when needed. It was in what they refused to do, in the fights they didn't pick, in the bait they didn't take, in the provocations they ignored. Now contrast this with how most people operate today in our modern world of instant communication and constant connectivity. You respond to every email immediately, as if response time is the ultimate measure of professionalism, as if making someone wait 3 hours for a reply is somehow disrespectful. You accept every meeting invitation, as if availability equals importance, as if having a full calendar means you're valuable. You say yes to every opportunity, as if quantity equals success, as if doing more things automatically produces better results. You check your phone every 3 minutes, as if constant connection equals relevance, as if being unreachable for an hour means you're missing something crucial. This is not strength, this is not power, this is not success, this is reactivity. And reactivity is the behavioral signature of powerlessness, the mark of someone who is controlled by their environment rather than controlling it. Here's a principle that will change how you see everything, that will make you fundamentally reconsider how you allocate your most precious resource. Availability breeds cheapness. When you're always available, always responding, always there, always accessible, you lose scarcity. You become the air that everyone breathes but nobody values. And in a world governed by basic economics, by the fundamental laws of supply and demand, things that aren't scarce aren't valuable. Your time becomes cheap, your attention becomes worthless, your presence becomes forgettable, your opinion becomes background noise. You're the person people reach out to when they need something, but never think about otherwise. Jung understood this from a psychological perspective, from his deep exploration of how the human psyche actually operates. Every time you react, every time you respond without thinking, every time you let external stimuli determine your internal state, you're spending psychic energy. And not just any energy, not the simple physical energy that can be restored with sleep and food, but the specific type of energy required for deep thought, creative breakthrough, genuine self-understanding, and the kind of focused work that actually changes your life. When you live in a constant state of reaction, when your entire day is structured around responding to other people's priorities, you never drop deep enough into yourself to access the layers where real transformation happens, where original ideas emerge, where you connect with something meaningful. The person who cannot hold their energy, who leaks it out through constant reaction, cannot create depth. The person who cannot create depth cannot produce anything truly original. And the person who cannot produce anything original will always be replaceable, always be competing on price rather than value, always be fighting for scraps rather than commanding premium resources. So ask yourself these questions and answer them honestly, because your future depends on your willingness to confront these uncomfortable truths. How much of your day is spent reacting versus creating? How much of your energy is scattered across meaningless responses versus concentrated on meaningful work? How much of your identity is built on being busy versus being effective? How much of your self-worth comes from how full your calendar is rather than from the actual impact you're making? Because here's the uncomfortable truth that you need to hear. That might sting, but will ultimately free you. Your busyness might be the very shield you're using to avoid becoming who you're actually capable of being. It's safer to stay busy than to confront the question of whether you're building something meaningful. It's easier to hide behind endless activity than to face the possibility that you're avoiding the hard, deep work that actually matters. Let's get precise about what we're actually talking about here, because this distinction is everything. The difference between a life of quiet desperation and a life of genuine power. There are two fundamentally different ways to live, two completely different operating systems for human existence. Most people operate in the first mode their entire lives without even realizing there's a second option, like fish who don't know they're swimming in water because they've never experienced anything else. Reactive living means you're constantly responding to external stimuli, like a pinball bouncing between bumpers. You're urgent, frantic, driven by fear and deadlines, and the terrifying possibility that you might miss something important. You act because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't, not because you've carefully considered whether action serves your interests. You're always putting out fires, always behind, always catching up, always one crisis away from total overwhelm. Your decisions are made under pressure, in states of stress and scarcity, and your actions are dictated by whatever is screaming loudest for your attention in this moment. You operate from your amygdala, your primitive brain, the part designed to keep you alive in the face of immediate threats, but absolutely terrible at complex strategic thinking. Strategic living means you observe first, select carefully, and wait for the right opening, like a master chess player who sees 10 moves ahead. You act from intention, not desperation. From clarity, not panic. You're oriented toward long-term outcomes rather than short-term relief. You make decisions from a place of calm assessment rather than emotional reactivity. You understand the larger game being played, the forces and incentives shaping everyone's behavior, and you position yourself accordingly. You operate from your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain capable of abstract thinking, long-term planning, and genuine strategic sophistication. The difference isn't just in outcomes, though outcomes matter. It's in the quality of existence itself, in how it feels to move through the world, in the relationship you have with time and possibility, and your own agency. Now, I want to introduce you to a concept that will reframe everything, that will give you a completely different lens through which to view success and power. Strategic patience. This isn't just patience in the conventional sense. Most people think patience means passively waiting and hoping things get better, like a child waiting for Christmas morning. That's not what this is at all. Strategic patience is patience with purpose. It's the active process of positioning yourself within the larger pattern while others exhaust themselves fighting for scraps. It's not waiting for your moment to arrive like some gift from the universe. It's creating the conditions that make your moment inevitable. It's understanding that there are seasons to life and business and relationships, that there are times to plant and times to harvest, and that trying to harvest when you should be planting is how you end up with nothing. Think about the difference in relationship to time itself, because this reveals something fundamental about consciousness and power. The person who's always in a hurry, who's always rushing, who's always cramming more into less time, lives in their ego. They need to prove themselves, to be seen, to be validated by external markers of success. Every action is a desperate attempt to demonstrate their worth to an audience that probably isn't even paying attention, that's too busy performing their own worthiness dance to notice yours. They're trying to convince the world and themselves that they matter, that they're valuable, that their existence is justified, and that desperate need for validation drives them to constant, exhausting, ultimately meaningless activity. The person who moves with strategic stillness, who's comfortable with empty space in their calendar, who can sit with uncertainty without needing to immediately resolve it, lives in their self. They're not performing for anyone. They're not trying to convince anyone of anything. They're understanding the game, watching the patterns, learning the rhythms, waiting for the one move that changes the entire board. They've moved beyond the need for constant external validation because they've developed internal validation, a sense of worth that doesn't depend on being busy or being seen or being praised. Ego needs action to feel alive. Self needs awareness to be effective. This brings us to something Jung called the martyr complex. And if you're honest with yourself, you'll probably recognize this pattern in your own life. This is the addiction to suffering, the belief that struggle equals virtue, that the more you sacrifice and endure and push through pain, the more righteous you become. It's the voice in your head that says, I have to work this hard because that's what good people do. I have to sacrifice my health and my relationships and my peace of mind because that's the price of success. I have to prove that I'm willing to suffer more than others because suffering is the currency of worthiness. But Machiavelli would tell you something different, something that might sound harsh but is ultimately liberating. The ruler who fights every battle is the ruler who commits suicide by power. You cannot sustain influence if you're constantly depleting yourself, constantly operating at the edge of exhaustion, constantly one bad week away from collapse. Real power requires conservation. Real strength requires knowing when to hold back. Real influence comes from having reserves when everyone else is depleted, from being able to act decisively when others are too exhausted to respond. The most dangerous person in any negotiation is the one who doesn't need the deal, who's perfectly fine walking away, who has options. The most influential person in any room is the one who's comfortable with silence, who doesn't feel compelled to fill every pause with words. The most powerful player in any game is the one who's willing to walk away entirely, who values their peace more than winning any particular contest. This is the paradox of power that most people never understand. You gain it by being willing to not use it. You acquire influence by demonstrating that you don't need to exercise it constantly. You become valuable by showing that your attention and energy are scarce resources that must be earned, not freely given to anyone who asks. So how do you actually make this shift? How do you go from reactive to strategic, from scattered to focused, from exhausted to effective? Because understanding the theory is one thing, but implementation is where most people fail. It starts with a fundamental redefinition of what strategic thinking actually means, because most people have it completely backwards. Strategic thinking isn't about doing everything, about covering all bases, about having a plan for every contingency. It's about doing the one thing that determines all the other outcomes. It's about understanding the difference between what's urgent and what's important, and having the courage to focus on importance even when urgency is screaming at you, even when everyone around you is treating urgent things as if they're important. Important things are rarely urgent, and urgent things are rarely important, but the urgent always feels more pressing in the moment. Here's a truth that will save you years of wasted effort, years of spinning your wheels and wondering why you're not getting ahead. A mediocre idea, executed at the right time, will always outperform a brilliant idea executed at the wrong time. Timing isn't everything, it's the only thing. All your preparation, all your planning, all your brilliant strategy means nothing if you move too early or too late. The right action at the wrong time is the wrong action. And the way you develop timing isn't through constantly acting and hoping something works. It's through patient observation, pattern recognition, and the discipline to wait. But here's where it gets psychologically uncomfortable, where the rubber meets the road and most people turn back. When you stop being constantly busy, something happens that most people aren't prepared for, something that feels so threatening that they immediately retreat back into familiar patterns of activity. You come face to face with your shadow. Jung used this term to describe the parts of yourself that you've repressed, denied, pushed down into the basement of your psyche because they're too threatening or painful or shameful to acknowledge. The fears you've been running from, the truths you've been too busy to confront, the questions you've been avoiding by keeping your schedule so packed that you never have time to think. And one of the most common shadows in high-achieving, ambitious people is this: the fear of being worthless if you're not constantly producing. Think about what you're actually afraid of when you imagine slowing down, when you picture having empty space in your calendar, when you consider not being busy for a while. You're afraid people will forget about you, that you'll become invisible, that your relevance depends on constant visibility. You're afraid you'll become irrelevant, that in the fast-moving modern world, being still for even a moment means being left behind forever. You're afraid that if you're not constantly proving your value through visible activity, someone will realize you never had any value to begin with, that you've been faking it all along, that you're a fraud who's been found out. You're afraid that stillness will reveal the emptiness you've been frantically covering up with motion, that beneath all your activity there's just a void, a fundamental purposelessness that you can't face. This is the real reason people stay busy. Not because they have to, not because their job demands it, not because they have no choice, but because they're terrified of what they'll discover if they stop. They're running from themselves, and busyness is the perfect hiding place. But here's what happens on the other side of that fear, if you're brave enough to push through it. When you create strategic stillness, when you build intentional space into your life, where you're not reacting, not producing, not performing, not proving anything to anyone, you enter what I call the incubation phase. This is when real ideas form, not the surface-level ideas you have during your morning shower, but the deep, original, game-changing ideas that can only emerge from sustained contemplation. This is when genuine insight emerges, the kind of understanding that shifts your entire perspective. This is when transformation becomes possible, because transformation requires space, requires emptiness, requires the absence of constant input and activity. Think of it like a seed in darkness, beneath the soil where no one can see. Nothing visible is happening. From the outside, it looks like nothing at all, like inactivity, like waste of potential. But beneath the surface, complex processes are unfolding that cannot be rushed. Roots are forming, structure is developing, energy is being concentrated and organized. And when the moment is right, when all the invisible preparation is complete, something breaks through that couldn't have existed without that period of apparent inactivity. Your best ideas don't come when you're frantically busy, when you're stressed and overscheduled and jumping from one thing to another. They come when you've created enough space for your unconscious mind to do its work, to make connections that your conscious mind would never make, to synthesize information in novel ways. Creativity requires emptiness. Insight requires stillness. Breakthrough requires the absence of constant input. But here's the social challenge you need to be prepared for, the obstacle that stops most people even when they understand everything I've said so far. When you start doing less, when you start saying no, when you start protecting your energy like it's your most valuable possession because it is, people are going to be uncomfortable. They're used to your availability. They've built systems, informal and formal, that depend on your constant responsiveness. They've come to expect that you'll always be there, always helping, always accommodating, always putting their needs before your own. And when you change that dynamic, when you establish boundaries, when you start prioritizing your own energy and agenda over their convenience, they're going to push back. Hard. Some will call you selfish, implying that you have some moral obligation to be constantly available to them. Some will say you've changed, usually not as a neutral observation, but as an accusation. Some will accuse you of not being a team player, of not caring about others, of becoming cold or distant or arrogant. Some will try to guilt you back into your old patterns by making you feel like you're abandoning them, like your boundaries are a personal rejection. This is where you need what Jung called a strong ego boundary. Not ego in the sense of arrogance or thinking you're better than others, but ego in the sense of a clearly defined self that can withstand external pressure without collapsing, without reverting to people-pleasing, without abandoning what you know is right. You need the capacity to be disliked, to accept that not everyone will approve of your choices. You need the strength to disappoint people, to let them down, to fail to meet their expectations. You need the courage to protect your energy, even when others want to drain it, even when they try to make you feel guilty for having boundaries. Because here's what nobody tells you about personal transformation. what the self-help books gloss over. The people who benefited from your old patterns will resist your new ones. Your growth will threaten their comfort. Your boundaries will challenge their entitlement. Your strategic restraint will expose their lack of it, will make them uncomfortable by showing them what's possible, by holding up a mirror to their own scattered energy and lack of focus. And you have to be okay with that. You have to be willing to let some relationships change or end. You have to be willing to be misunderstood. You have to be willing to be the villain in someone else's story. Because the alternative is remaining trapped in patterns that drain you, that keep you reactive, that prevent you from ever accessing your full power. So what actually happens when you make this shift? What changes when you move from constant reactivity to strategic selectivity? What does life look like on the other side of this transformation? First, understand this fundamental reality. Not everyone is going to like it. Some people, the ones who respect strength and recognize value, will respect you more. They'll recognize that your scarcity makes you more valuable, that your selectivity makes your contributions more meaningful. They'll understand that when you say yes, it actually means something because you're willing to say no. They'll appreciate that your time and attention are gifts rather than entitlements. These are the people worth having in your life, the ones who value mutual respect over convenience. But others, often the people who were benefiting most from your lack of boundaries, will call you arrogant, difficult, or selfish. They'll miss the version of you that was always available, always accommodating, always bending to meet their needs. They'll resent that you've changed the terms of engagement, that you're no longer willing to sacrifice yourself for their comfort. They'll try to manipulate you back into your old patterns through guilt, anger, or social pressure. And here's what you need to understand. What will give you the strength to maintain your boundaries when the pressure mounts? Respect lasts longer than being liked. Being liked is easy. Just say yes to everything, agree with everyone, never assert your own needs, never challenge anyone, never prioritize yourself. Be a mirror that reflects whatever others want to see. Be a servant that anticipates every need. Be a doormat that never complains about being stepped on. You'll be very popular. Everyone will think you're so nice, so accommodating, so easy to work with, and you'll be completely, utterly, irreversibly powerless. You'll wake up one day and realize you've spent your entire life living for other people's approval and have nothing of your own to show for it. Respect is earned through boundaries, through consistency, through demonstrating that your time and energy are valuable enough to protect, through showing that you operate from principles, not from the desperate need for approval, through being willing to walk away from situations that don't serve you, even when walking away is uncomfortable or unpopular. This brings us to the core principle that explains everything we've been discussing. Selective energy equals power. When you stop scattering your energy across 1,000 meaningless tasks, when you stop being reactive and start being strategic, when you concentrate your finite resources on the few things that actually matter, several transformative things happen. You make decisions faster because you're not mentally exhausted from 1,000 micro-decisions throughout the day. Decision fatigue isn't depleting your willpower. You have the mental clarity to see situations accurately and respond appropriately. You recognize real opportunities because you're not drowning in noise. When you're constantly busy, constantly distracted, constantly jumping between contexts, everything looks like an opportunity and nothing looks like an opportunity. But when you're calm, focused, operating from a place of strategic stillness, real opportunities become obvious. They stand out from the background noise. You influence situations more deeply because when you do engage, you're fully present rather than partly distracted. People can feel when you're fully there versus when you're mentally somewhere else. Full presence is so rare in modern life that it becomes a source of power in itself. Your relationships fundamentally change, and not just in who stays and who goes, but in the quality of all your interactions. When you're not always available, your presence becomes valuable rather than taken for granted. When you stop performing productivity theater, your actual results speak for themselves without needing constant advertisement. When you're selective about your commitments, the commitments you do make carry actual weight. People start to notice that when you show up, something meaningful happens. The meeting you attend is the one where decisions get made. When you speak, it's worth listening to. because you don't waste words on trivial observations. When you act, it matters because you've chosen your moment carefully and committed fully. This is what Machiavelli called virtue, though the concept is often mistranslated and misunderstood in English. It's not virtue in the moral sense, not about being good or ethical in some abstract way. It's the combination of strategic intelligence, decisive action, and perfect timing. It's the capacity to read a situation accurately, understanding all the forces and incentives at play, to wait until the precise moment of maximum leverage when your action will have the greatest effect, and then to act with devastating effectiveness, to commit fully and execute flawlessly. The person who does less but times it perfectly will always dominate the person who does more but scatters their impact, always, without exception. Think about this in practical, concrete terms across different domains of life. In meetings, the person who talks constantly, who has an opinion on everything, who needs to be heard, is rarely the most influential. It's the person who waits, who listens actively, who absorbs what everyone else is saying, and then speaks once and shifts the entire direction of the conversation. Their rarity makes their intervention powerful. In negotiations, it's not the person who's eager and available, who's obviously desperate for the deal, who gets the best terms. It's the person who's willing to walk away, who has other options, who demonstrates through their behavior that they're perfectly fine without this particular agreement. That willingness to lose, it gives them everything. In careers, it's not the person who applies to everything, who's constantly hunting, who's obviously desperate for a better position, who lands the perfect opportunity. It's the person who's so clearly valuable in their current position, so obviously competent and focused, that opportunities come seeking them. That scarcity creates demand. In relationships, it's not the person who's always available, always responding immediately, always prioritizing the other person, who creates genuine attraction and respect. It's the person with their own life, their own purpose, their own priorities, who creates fascination. That independence creates desire. Strategic restraint creates gravitational pull. This is a fundamental principle of human psychology and power dynamics. When you're constantly chasing, you repel. You signal desperation, low value, lack of options. When you're strategically still, you attract. You signal abundance, high value, selectivity. This isn't about playing games or being manipulative or pretending to be something you're not. This is about understanding a fundamental principle of how human beings assess value and allocate attention. Value is determined by scarcity. Influence is determined by selectivity. Power is determined by the ability to withhold, to say no, to not engage, to walk away. The moment you become truly willing to lose something is the moment you gain actual leverage over it. The moment you stop needing approval is the moment people start seeking yours. The moment you stop proving yourself is the moment your value becomes self-evident to everyone paying attention. This is the ultimate paradox of power, the secret that masters understand and that the masses never grasp. You must be willing to not have it in order to truly possess it. You must be willing to lose in order to win. You must be willing to be nothing in order to become everything. So, let's bring this full circle and crystallize what we've discovered, what this journey has revealed about the nature of power, energy, and human potential. Power lies not in constant action, but in strategic restraint. Your energy, your attention, your psychological capacity to engage deeply with what actually matters, this is your most precious resource. Not your time, though time certainly matters and is irreplaceable. Not your money, though money matters and provides options. But your energy, the quality of consciousness you bring to any situation, the depth of focus you can sustain, the creativity you can access when fully present. This is the resource that determines everything else in your life. And in a world specifically designed to extract and scatter this resource, to keep you fragmented and reactive and depleted, protecting it is not just smart strategy, it's an act of revolution. It's a refusal to participate in a system built to consume you. Think about the system you're operating in. Really examine it with clear eyes. Every notification is engineered to fragment your attention, pulling you away from deep work into shallow reaction. Every social platform is designed by teams of psychologists and behavioral economists to keep you endlessly scrolling, endlessly comparing, endlessly consuming content that leaves you feeling empty. Every workplace culture, especially in knowledge work and technology, rewards visible busyness over actual productivity, presence over results, hours logged over problems solved. Every social expectation pushes you toward constant availability, immediate response, perpetual accessibility. The entire structure, from the macro level of economic systems to the micro level of social norms, is built to drain you, to keep you reactive, to prevent you from ever accumulating enough energy to see clearly, think deeply, and act decisively. So when you refuse to play that game, when you establish boundaries that seem unreasonable by conventional standards, when you protect your energy with the ferocity of someone guarding their life, because that's exactly what you're doing, you're not just changing your personal circumstances. You're rejecting the entire framework. You're saying no to a system that treats human attention and energy as infinite resources to be extracted and monetized. You're reclaiming sovereignty over your own consciousness in a world that profits from your distraction. Here's what I want you to understand at the deepest possible level, because this understanding will change everything about how you move through the world. Stop chasing the world's rhythm. Stop trying to keep up with everyone else's pace, with the artificial urgency created by 24-hour news cycles and social media feeds and workplace cultures that glorify overwork. Stop measuring your worth by how busy you appear, by how quickly you respond to messages, by how much you can cram into a single day, by how many items you can check off an endless to-do list that just generates more items. Start conducting your own tempo. Begin orchestrating your life according to your own sense of timing and priority, rather than reacting to everyone else's demands. Move at the speed that allows for depth, for genuine understanding, for synthesis and integration, rather than just information consumption. Act at the frequency that allows for impact, for meaningful contribution, for work that compounds over time, rather than activity that evaporates the moment it's done. Engage at the level that allows for presence, for full attention, for the quality of consciousness that creates real connection and genuine insight, rather than superficial interaction. Say no to everything that doesn't align with your actual priorities, and I mean everything. Even if saying no makes you unpopular, even if it disappoints people, even if it means some relationships change or end. Most people spend their lives saying yes to things they don't care about, because they're afraid of what others will think if they say no. And they wonder why they never have time or energy for the things they claim are important to them. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot live for others' approval and for your own purpose simultaneously. Choose. Because here's what happens when you do this consistently over time, when you make strategic restraint not just a temporary experiment, but a permanent way of operating. You become someone who actually creates things rather than just responds to things. You become a source rather than a relay. You generate original value rather than just processing other people's ideas and requests. You become someone whose contributions carry weight because they're not diluted across 1,000 directions, spread so thin that they're barely visible. When you do contribute, it matters. People notice, things change. You become someone who shapes situations rather than being shaped by them. You become a cause rather than an effect. You operate from agency rather than reactivity. You stop being one more exhausted person barely keeping up with the minimum requirements, indistinguishable from everyone else in the race, and you become someone operating on an entirely different frequency, playing an entirely different game that most people don't even know exists. The world will keep spinning at its frantic pace. The hustle culture will keep glorifying exhaustion, keep posting 4 a.m. wake-up routines and productivity porn, keep pretending that burnout is a badge of honor. The system will keep demanding more from everyone caught in its gears, extracting value until there's nothing left, and then moving on to the next person. But you'll be standing still, watching with clear eyes, waiting with strategic patience, conserving your energy for the one moment that changes everything. And when that moment comes, and you'll recognize it when it does because you've created the space to actually perceive it, you'll have what no one else has: the full force of your undivided power, concentrated into a single decisive action. This is the art of strategic restraint. This is the hidden mechanism that separates those who achieve everything while seeming to do nothing from those who do everything while achieving nothing. This is how the most successful people win, not by fighting every battle, because fighting every battle is how you guarantee you'll lose the war, but by choosing the one battle that makes all the others irrelevant. They let others exhaust themselves on pointless skirmishes, while they position themselves for the decisive engagement. In a world addicted to motion, to constant activity, to the performance of productivity, your strategic stillness is revolutionary. It's a form of resistance that the system isn't designed to handle, because the system depends on your reactivity. In a culture that glorifies exhaustion, that treats burnout as a rite of passage, that measures commitment by suffering, your preserved energy is dangerous. It gives you options, it gives you clarity, it gives you the capacity to act when others can only react. In a system designed to scatter everyone's focus across a million meaningless things, keeping you busy but never effective, your concentrated attention is unstoppable. It's a superpower that becomes more valuable every day, as everyone else's attention becomes more fragmented. So the question isn't whether you should do less. The mathematics of effectiveness make it clear that strategic restraint produces better results than scattered activity. The question is, are you brave enough to disappoint people? Are you strong enough to withstand the judgment that comes with not meeting others' expectations? Are you clear enough on your priorities to protect them against the 1,000 invisible pressures trying to pull you away from them? Are you secure enough in yourself to not need constant external validation through visible busyness? Because if you are, if you can cultivate this strategic restraint, if you can master the art of doing less while accomplishing more, then you're not just changing your own trajectory, not just improving your personal outcomes. You're embodying a completely different way of existing in the world. You're demonstrating that there's an alternative to the exhausting treadmill that most people accept as inevitable. You're proving that power comes not from constant motion, but from strategic stillness. And that, more than any single achievement or accomplishment, more than any external marker of success, is what true power actually looks like. It's not loud, it's not performative, it's not constantly announcing itself. It's quiet, patient, and devastatingly effective when it finally moves. The masters of this world, the people who truly shape outcomes rather than just react to them, don't announce themselves with constant noise. They don't prove their importance through exhausting effort. They make themselves known through the precision of their rare interventions, through the disproportionate impact of their selective engagement. They understand something that takes most people a lifetime to learn, if they learn it at all. That energy is everything, that focus is power, that scarcity creates value, and that the ability to do nothing is often more valuable than the ability to do something. So, take a breath, a real one, deep and slow. Step back from the chaos of constant activity. Look at your life, not from within the storm, where everything seems urgent and necessary, but from above it, with the perspective that distance provides. See the patterns. Identify what actually matters, what moves the needle, what compounds over time, what you'll care about in 5 years or 10 years or on your deathbed. And then, with ruthless selectivity, with the decisiveness that comes from absolute clarity, pour everything you have into those few things while letting everything else fall away. This is not laziness. This is not passivity. This is not giving up or lowering your standards or accepting mediocrity. This is the opposite. This is refusing to dilute your excellence across things that don't matter. This is concentrating your power instead of scattering it. This is choosing to be exceptional at what matters rather than mediocre at everything. This is strategic restraint, and it might be the most powerful tool you never knew you had, the secret weapon that's been available to you all along, but that you couldn't see because you were too busy being busy. The choice is yours. You can keep doing what you're doing, keep running faster on the treadmill, keep hoping that eventually your effort will pay off if you just work hard enough. Or you can step off entirely, find your own path, move at your own pace, and discover what you're actually capable of when you stop scattering your energy and start focusing it like a laser. One path is crowded, exhausting, and leads to the same place for everyone. The other is lonely at first, requires courage to walk, and leads somewhere most people never reach. Which will you choose?